Should you only grow cherry tomatoes? Today I'm going to make a case about why you should, or why you might want to think about this at least. Stay tuned to find out what the heck my reasoning is all about coming up. So cooler temperatures are on their way. The hotter temperatures of summer are fading into the past here, but this cherry tomato plant behind me is still growing like an absolute beast. No signs of disease, looks really healthy, still flowering, some fruit on it. It's super vigorous. And it's doing this when all of my other larger tomatoes that are grown in the field here are pulled out of the ground. And they were pulled out of the ground because production was winding down, disease was setting in, the plants weren't healthy, the plants were dying. So you have the big plant dying, or the big fruited plant dying, but here you have the small fruited plant growing and growing and growing. In fact, it's the biggest it's ever been all year, and it still looks pretty darn good. So given the health of this plant, should we consider just growing cherry tomatoes? Maybe. Let's talk more about that. If you're anything like me, you probably plant a lot of large-sized tomatoes relative to cherry tomatoes. And why is that? Why do we plant more large tomato varieties versus small tomato varieties like cherry tomatoes? Well, one, I think variety. I think you can get a lot more variety in bigger sized tomatoes. Color, texture, shape, taste, size of the fruit, all those things offer a lot of variety when you start looking at some of the cultivars that are in the larger tomato spectrum. When you start getting into cherry tomatoes, you start boxing yourself into a corner a little bit more when it comes to flavor, color, shape, those types of things. So I think variety is one reason why we might grow larger tomatoes. I know one reason I grow a lot of bigger tomatoes is because they are just easier to handle. I would rather be picking big tomatoes, watermelons, pumpkins, and oranges over blueberries, cherries, and cherry tomatoes. Picking small fruit with my fingers is just not something I enjoy. I get flashbacks from when I was a kid living in upstate New York, and I used to have to pick cherries off of a ladder in the tree in my parents' yard. While I love the cherries, I hated picking them. They were so small and you just had to keep picking and picking to eventually fill up a bowl. I didn't enjoy it. So now when I go to plant things, I like to plant bigger plants that develop bigger fruit, whether that's big cucumbers, big tomatoes, watermelon. I don't like dealing with small sized fruit, but that may be holding me back. That may be a limiting belief. Another reason I think we plant bigger tomatoes is bigger just more exciting. I mean, we get stoked about growing a 1 pound or 2 pound or maybe even larger tomato, these humongous tomatoes. It's like, wow, look what I grew. This is amazing. When if you had 1,000 cherry tomatoes on here, it's not as exciting. They're small and there's a lot of color, but it doesn't stand out as much as that one big tomato. So maybe cherry tomatoes aren't as exciting. But if you think about these three reasons, do any of those really make bigger better? And is bigger better? Or like I said, are these limiting beliefs? I'm not sure bigger is better, because again, at this point in the season, all of my large variety tomatoes are out of the field due to disease pressure and dying off, while the cherry tomato stays here thriving, looking healthy, showing no sign of disease, showing a lot of vigor. So I'm starting to question, bigger might not be better. If I zoom out and I look at the lifespan of these cherry tomatoes, these two plants, and these are just two plants, were planted about a month earlier than all of my other tomatoes, and they've been in the ground now a month later. Now, they're in the ground, they're not necessarily fruiting a ton right now, so I can't say that that's a total advantage. They are growing, and we know with tomatoes, more greenery, more foliage isn't always better. Like, fruit production is what we're after, not greenery production. So we can't just say a longer time period is better. If you're not getting a longer fruiting period, and if you're not getting more fruit from all this greenery, then it might not be better. But maybe we could get more fruit over the long term because the plant's healthier. In order for a plant to produce a lot of fruit and more fruit over a longer period of time, it has to stay alive to do so. And to do that, it can't succumb to disease. So when big tomatoes go down, I often find that a lot of these smaller tomatoes keep going. So what is that thing? Why are these plants more disease resistant, or at least appear to be more disease resistant? One thing that I can't help but think is cherry tomatoes are closer to their wild relative. The original tomato growing out there in the wild, that was probably a very small fruited variety, something almost like a currant sized tomato. And over time, we've bred those to try and get the fruit size larger and larger. Well, when you stop at cherry tomato size, you're stopping sooner in that evolution versus trying to get a huge mortgage lifter tomato. So is the fact that there's been maybe less breeding and this is closer to the wild make it more resilient? We know that the more you cultivate plants, the more challenges that might arise. For example, out of a university in Washington, there's some studies showing that cultivated plants actually form less beneficial relationships with microbes in the soil. So more cultivation isn't always a good thing. Yes, we can breed in disease resistance, but I think we're only adding disease resistance back in because we've bred some of it out when we've tried to get other traits to exhibit themselves. So we have to put disease resistant packages back into these plants because we went for taste, flavor, texture, size, where if we stayed with the smaller, more resilient tomato, they already have the disease resistance in them. That's just a theory. I'm not saying it's true, but I think there is some logic to that actually makes sense. So the big question is if this is true, if cherry tomatoes, if smaller variety tomatoes are more resilient, if they can withstand more disease pressure, is it worth just growing those over larger tomatoes? It depends. To do this analysis, we have to start to look at trade-offs. Well, I can easily pick a 1 pound tomato off a larger variety plant. Well, if I'm picking cherry tomatoes, I have about 2 cups of cherry tomatoes here. This is half a pound. So I'd need 4 cups or a pint. I think that's a pint. 4 cups worth of cherry tomatoes or 40 cherry tomatoes to make a pound. So that's 40 times I have to touch a piece of fruit to get a pound, where on larger varieties, I might only have to touch a piece of fruit once. The question then becomes, does volume outweigh size? Can we pick enough volume of fruit off cherry tomatoes to outweigh the larger, less total fruit that we're picking off larger varieties? I'm not so sure of that. I kind of think the larger varieties will win out just by sheer size. You know, it takes five 1 pound tomatoes to get 5 pounds, obviously. When if we look at cherry tomatoes, we have to pick 200 tomatoes to get that same 5 pounds. So again, more touches on the fruit. Can this plant produce that much fruit? I don't know, some cherry tomatoes are super vigorous. I think it might actually be possible. When it comes to processing that fruit or doing something with that fruit, it's obviously gonna require more handling, like it's more fruit to cut up if you want to put it into a salad versus cutting up one big piece of fruit. Sometimes the fruit might not be a fit for the usage. Like if you need a slicer tomato, you need a slicer tomato. A bunch of cherry tomatoes aren't going to cut it. They're going to be squeezing out of the sides of your sandwich or off of your burger. So I get it. Sometimes cherry tomatoes just aren't a fit in terms of function. But if you're just going for straight up volume and you want to can them, maybe it makes sense. Now, if you're stuck on a certain flavor that you could only get in a larger variety tomato, okay, maybe that's one thing, but maybe you could find the equivalent in a cherry tomato. If you're into really sweet tomatoes, I mean, cherry tomatoes are the winner there, from sweet millions to the super sweets. There's a lot of options when it comes to cherry tomatoes if you like sweet tomatoes. So I think they could win out on flavor in that direction. Now, if you're making sauce with them, there is more skin and seeds in a cup worth of cherry tomatoes than there would be in a cup of large tomatoes. Like, you're just gonna get more skin and seeds. If that's a problem for you, then you probably don't want to use cherry tomatoes for sauce. Now, we just put skin and seeds in our sauce, blend it up. It's not a big deal, but some people, they don't want the skin, they don't want the seeds. So that would obviously be easier to peel those and get the seeds out of larger tomatoes versus smaller tomatoes. So now that I've presented this case, what do you think? Should you grow only cherry tomatoes, or should you grow more cherry tomatoes than larger varieties and make the larger varieties the novelty and move the cherry tomatoes into the production category? Kind of flip the script a little bit. What do you think? Are cherry tomatoes more resilient? Will they last longer? Will they do better in your system? I may trial this next year, do a side-by-side comparison, you know, cherry tomato plant here, large variety here, and we'll have a fruit face-off. Which one can produce more weight in fruit over the same period of time? Put the plants in the ground, and then we'll just keep track of fruit over the whole period of time, weigh it all, and see which one comes up with more fruit, and maybe start to answer this question. But sometimes it's not all about which one can produce more fruit. Sometimes it's just about which one is a better fit for you and your context, and maybe producing less fruit in a cherry tomato, but having those plants survive for longer is actually better in your system. I hope it gets you thinking. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment below. Thanks for watching the video. Until next time, be nice, be thankful, and do the work.